Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Terrorism, a word we hear all of the time. But what do we mean when we use it? Is terrorism a specific form of criminality practiced under certain circumstances focused on a specific group of people? When we consider weapons, is there much that separates handmade bombs and high-tech drones? Ultimately, it would appear the only difference between justice and terrorism is whose side you are on. To Crosstalk Terrorism, I'm joined by my guest in Washington, William Bloom. He is an author of books on U.S. foreign policy and an internet newsletter called Anti-Empire Report. We also have Max Abrams. He is a terrorist expert and a fellow at Johns Hopkins University. And finally, we cross to Fahim Yunus. He is a clinical associate professor at the University of Maryland and founder of MuslimAmerican.com. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Fahim, if I go to you first, why is Boston called terrorism, but Aurora, Sandy Hook, Tucson, and Columbine not?
That's a great question, Peter, and let me start by saying that as a member of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Muslims who believe in the Messiah, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Qadiani, we were the first Muslim American organization to make it very clear that there is no concept of holy war in Islam, that there is no such thing as jihad against the infidel where you take a sword and try to convert the world. Now, why is that important? Because the word Islamic terrorism to me is an oxymoron. I'm coming to exactly what you're asking me. But the point is, these differences will already exist. They always will exist. And the Muslim community in America today, in fact, is asking that same very question, that why are some things labeled terrorism versus another, which is not. But more importantly, the discussion that is going on in the dinner tables, on the dinner tables these days among Muslim families is that why is it that always a non-Muslim, when somebody goes to Aurora or Sandy Hook, that they're always insane, but when a Muslim commits an act of terrorism, that they're always perfectly fine psychologically?
Max, what do you think about the label terrorism? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Can I hop in?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I completely disagree. The definition of terrorism that we adhere to, certainly in North America, is threefold. First, it should involve a non-state actor, that is, an individual or a group. Secondly, the targeting, the violence, should be directed against civilians, some kind of a civilian target. And third, there should be some kind of a political aim. And it's that last point, that last part of the definition, which separates the Boston attack from the other ones which you just mentioned. The other ones which you mentioned didn't have any kind of a political motive. And so by definition, we do not regard them as terrorism. Whereas in the Boston case, the soul brother who lived says that the motive was indeed political. It was religious. It was Islam. Now, I'm not saying he's in any way representative
do we really know that?
Faith.
Do we really know that?
Greatly distorts
do we
it.
really know that? That it was political? Do we really know that?
Do we trust? That's what the perpetrators themselves say.
Okay, one is dead and one can't talk. William, jump in.
Yes, I would assume it was political. The older brother who's dead, he's made statements making it very clear that he has a great beef with American foreign policy, as one example. So I knew right away it was political, and that's what it is.
Fahim, go ahead.
So it can be called terrorism.
Fahim, go ahead.
Once again, and that is why, Peter, I keep repeating this. It's very important that we don't look at millions of Americans who are Muslim in America as suspects. And that is why it's very important. I agree with Mac in principle that the Muslim community has to come out and denounce very clearly.
Muslims.
William, go ahead. Go ahead, Millet.
I agree with you, Mac. My point was...
William, go ahead. Jump in.
No, I agree, but that is the fear. That's where this is going to lead to. That's where it's going.
Not a million Muslims in America.
Okay, Max, you stressed non-state actors. Why is that so important to you?
Well, just because I'm speaking from North America. And so for us, when we talk about terrorism, that's what we're typically talking about. I understand that that's not the case. For example, if you go to the Middle East and you say you want to research terrorism, they may well think that you're talking about government attacks against civilians. Academics, though, tend to separate. We use a different definition when non-state actors attack civilians versus when state actors do.
It's very convenient. That's very convenient, isn't it? It's very convenient.
Well, it's certainly convenient for our research because
it's
we're
convenient
able to make
for
reliable
governments.
predictions
It's convenient
by only
for governments.
analyzing like units.
It's convenient for governments. Fahim, what do you think about that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you look around, you can find over 100 different definitions of the word terrorism. And there is a reason why we can never agree on any one definition, Peter. The reason is that it's a derogatory term. It's a horrible label that nobody wants to accept. So therefore, it's very common to find a war where each side is labeling the other as a terrorist. But here is a solution. I think instead of getting boxed into that term, as a member of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, once again, I would like to go to the deeper principle, which is the principle of sanctity of human life. And that is where our faith teaches us. And as an Ahmadi Muslim youth leader, that's what I've taught all the youths in America that I've interacted with, that Islam, our faith, teaches us that whosoever took one life, it's as if he took the life of all mankind. And whosoever gave one life to someone, it's as if they gave life to mankind. So I think the principle that we can agree with is the sanctity of human life. Mac, what do you think? Isn't that true?
Well, listen, we have a good term to cover that. It's called murder.
Can I just interrupt?
Go ahead, Max, jump in.
I just want to add one thing. When I say that terrorism, by most accounts in North America, focuses on non-state actors, that doesn't mean that when states use violence against civilians, it's somehow okay. The thing is that we have a very rich vocabulary. We can use many different words. Terrorism is not the only negative word to apply to actors in the international system. So I don't want to give... I don't want to in any way exonerate states from attacking civilians. Indeed, when states attack civilians, they tend to kill many, many more of them than when non-state actors do.
But that's terrorism, isn't it, Max?
It depends, I suppose, on which country you're in.
William?
We use a much more restrictive definition.
Go ahead, William.
I think the definition you gave before is for terrorism, I think, is quite suitable. There has to be a political motive involved. And usually there is with a state actor, with a government. But with individuals, there isn't always. In the case of Boston, I think it was political, and so we can call it terrorism. When the U.S. uses a drone to kill people in Pakistan or Afghanistan, the motive is political.
So that's terrorism.
And so that could be called terrorism.
Fahim, jump in.
Yeah,
Fahim, jump in.
Unless
I
you
think it's very important. This is a very important point, Peter, because if you just listen to Tom Brokaw last week on Meet the Press, he made the exact same point. The amount of resentment these drone attacks are creating, they're causing. There was this young Pakistani man who stepped up to Tom and he said that, I love America, but if you harm one hair on the head of my sister, that I will fight you forever. I think that's the important piece that we have to understand here in America, that by killing these civilians that we very conveniently sometimes call collateral damage, we are creating a whole generation of terrorists, if that's the term people like to use.
Max, go ahead.
I strongly disagree that the drone campaign is terrorism. Not only is it a state actor as opposed to a non-state actor, but the intended target is not civilian. The intended target is militants. And so you're right, mistakes are sometimes made. Civilians are killed. And that's terrible. But that's not by design. That's accidental. And so that makes it very different than terrorism, which is the intentional targeting of civilians.
William, go ahead.
No,
it's right.
Listen, That's propaganda. If you send out a drone on Monday to kill somebody, and it kills a bunch of people who are not your target, and you apologize, and on Tuesday you send out a drone again, and again it kills a bunch of civilians, and you apologize. On Wednesday, the same thing happens. At what point do you lose the right to use that excuse? You cannot use that excuse forever and ever. If you keep killing innocent civilians, you must face the jury at some time.
Fahim?
And Peter, once again, here's a prediction. I think we're never going to agree on a definition of the word terrorism. I sort of agree with Mac on this point. I was not calling drone attacks as terrorism. I'm not equating the two. But I think, once again, let's think of it from the lens of faith. Let me think of it from the lens of my faith. Ahmadi Muslim community, we believe that it's the principle of absolute justice that the world is craving for today. Those principles we can agree on. So when innocent lives are lost anywhere around the world, whether that's Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, we need to stand up and say this was unfair, this was unjust. And I think when we say that, that's a healing message. That's what's going to bring people together. The word terrorism is a divisive message, and I think it will continue to divide us. And again, my prediction is we will never agree on a definition.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on terrorism. Stay with our team. Okay, William, I'd like to go back to you. Before the break, you wanted to jump in. Go right ahead.
Yes, your guest keeps mentioning his religion. I don't think one has to be religious to hold a sanctity for life. And I resent when he implies that only a religious person, or maybe only a religious Muslim, can have such a high regard for the sanctity of life. I wish he would stop saying that.
Fahim, do you want to reply to that?
Sure, William. Again, I think I respect whatever belief you have. Please don't be offended. That's not my intent. I want to make sure that that's what my belief is. That's what drives me in life. I'm not a politician. What drives me in life are those core principles, and let's call them secular principles. Let's not even call them religious principles. But my idea is not to claim superiority here. My idea is really to come across with a healing principle. I think you would agree with that. Let's agree with sanctity of life. Forget about religion. I agree with you. Let's not give the color of religion.
Okay. Max, Obama said anytime bombs are used to target innocent civilians, it's an act of terror. What do you think about that?
This is what the president said?
Yes, that's a
President
quote.
Obama?
Yes, that's a quote.
I don't think that he was talking about by states. I think that he was talking about by non-state actors.
I'm just asking you what you think of the statement. I'm just asking you what you think of the statement. That's all.
Yeah, sure. So I think what he was thinking is that because it wasn't just one bomb, but it was multiple, that showed at that early point that it was intentional and that it was directed against civilians, and thus it was terror. I think if it was just one explosion that
sounds
went
like
off,
Fallujah.
we wouldn't have known at that time.
That's like Fallujah.
On yes. Which side? By which actor?
William, jump in.
Yes, the U.S. use of multiple bombs against multiple civilian targets. We have 1,001 examples of that. You can't find any definition of terrorism which would exclude American foreign policy. It's full of terrorism, and it has been for decades and decades.
That's not true.
Okay. Max, you want to reply to that?
I mean, I don't want to be too repetitive, but I mean, what the expert just said before me, that you can find no definitions of terrorism which would exclude U.S. foreign policy, is absurd. Indeed, the conventional explanation in North America would
Why do you keep saying North America?
U.S. foreign policy.
I thought terrorism affected the whole world.
Right, but words have different meanings in different regions. And in North America, terrorism denotes non-state actors. That's not true of other regions in the world.
Okay. William?
I live in North America, and I don't exclude state actors. I think the definition which was mentioned earlier, which is the same one used by the UN and the FBI and the CIA, is the use of violence or the threat of violence against civilians for a political purpose. That's a very good definition, and it applies as well to a state actor as to an individual. And it certainly includes almost all of U.S. foreign policy.
Fahim, your thoughts?
Peter, I'm going to try, and I think it's about time I disappoint William one more time, because the reason I have to bring religion back into the picture is because 5, 6, 7 million American Muslims, they're all being looked upon as suspects. You have to walk into my shoes to understand why that discussion is relevant to us, because all of a sudden, when the bombing happened in Boston, I was seeing patients in the hospital that day, and all of a sudden I knew, oh my God, please don't make him a Muslim. We are trying to raise our families here. We are trying to be good American citizens, and this is very difficult. This is very difficult. I understand that.
What you're saying is totally irrelevant.
Every time a Muslim is dragged into a conversation of terrorism, because somehow the implication is that the religion is fueling that. And once again, you will look at the media, start reading the newspapers from today on, and for the next month, they're going to try to find all those links and all those out-of-context verses from Quran. So therefore, I think it is important that we need to make sure our country and the world should know where we stand on these issues.
Okay. William, do you want to jump in?
Peter, can I just hop in for a second? I want to
Okay, Max,
I'd like
please.
to respond to that.
Go ahead.
I absolutely sympathize with the Muslim expert who just spoke, and I think that he's absolutely right that right now the Muslim community in the United States is under the lens. They were before, but particularly so in light of the bombings and the fact that the presumed perpetrators are Muslim. And what I want to stress from here more generally is that terrorism is politically counterproductive. And so when people use terrorism to advance their given political cause, it frequently backfires. Based on, details are still sketchy about what's going on with the Boston bombing, but my understanding, at least based on what the perpetrators seem to have said, is that it was done in the name of at least their interpretation of Islam. But in reality, terrorism is detrimental to Islam, and indeed, it's detrimental to the causes professed by any terrorist perpetrators.
William, do you want to reply to that?
I wish we could all stick to the subject. Whether the fact that this is a very hard time for Muslims in America is totally irrelevant. That is not the issue we're discussing. And whether the terrorism in question is successful or not, or counterproductive, is not the issue at all. Again, we're talking about terrorism per se, and how it's defined, and how we can judge U.S. foreign policy and other actors. I wish that the other guests would stick to that subject. I'm not concerned on this program with whether Muslims' feelings are hurt. That's not the issue. And the question of whether these acts are counterproductive or productive is also not relevant to the discussion.
Okay, Fahim, I think it's very interesting is that in America, a lot of people will look at Muslims and Islam is so alien, and it's where we get terrorism. But the fact of the matter is most people that die of terrorism in the world today are Muslim.
Well, that's exactly true. There are more Muslims dying at the hands of these terrorists than non-Muslims. And I think I fully agree with Mac that it's counterproductive. It is counterproductive to the core message of the faith. It is counterproductive.
Well, it's counterproductive for American foreign policy as well.
Countries. No question about that. I think exactly, because by what Peter King, look at that. What Peter King is now, this has already started. He's come out day one and he's saying we need more surveillance of these young Muslim men. How much more surveillance do you need? And do you understand the amount of resentment and the amount of conflicted identity and crisis of their minds that these Muslim youth are going through? What we are trying to do is trying to help them forge a strong Muslim and an American identity. We are trying to make sure that the American Muslim youth believe that there should be no conflict between their pledge of allegiance to their faith and their pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. That is a daunting task. And when people, and particularly strong politicians, visible people in the media, when they come out and make these derogatory statements as if everybody now has to stand in for the act of these two people, I think they have no idea the amount of alienation that's creating and how counterproductive that is right here in America.
What do you think about that, Max?
I absolutely agree. It's really a shame that people struggle so much to differentiate between Muslims, and I think that terrorists, like the ones who have bombed Boston, do a great disservice to the vast majority of Muslims. And I think that we need people like the ones that you're having on this program to do a better job of educating the American public and beyond.
William, do you think this will change American foreign policy? Go ahead.
I'm afraid not.
Okay.
And that is the basic problem. The basic problem is American foreign policy. We create anti-American terrorists every day of the week, and as long as we create them, we're gonna have to suffer the way we do. We must stop invading and bombing and overthrowing governments and torturing people, and stop creating anti-American terrorists. I say anti-American terrorists because we can't prevent the creation of all terrorists, but we can at least stop those who are motivated by anti-American feelings against U.S. foreign policy. That is the main task at hand for American citizens.
Max, would you like to reply to that?
I really don't think that there are going to be any fundamental changes in U.S. foreign policy.
Should it change?
The Obama
Should it change?
administration
Should it change?
No, I don't believe that it should change. I mean, the Obama administration, when you added on Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel, these are people who are very reluctant to deploy U.S. forces abroad. I don't think that they're going to start any more conflicts or increase manpower. I do think that the drone campaign will continue, however.
William, go ahead.
You're speaking of a man who has waged war against 7 nations, and you say he's reluctant to use armed forces abroad? What world are you living in?
Max, I'll give you the last word. Go ahead.
Well, sure. I'm making a comparative statement. In comparison to his predecessor, he's relatively gun-shy, except when it comes to the drone campaign.
Oh, really?
William, go ahead. Go ahead,
Is that
William.
the best you can do? Is that the best you can do, Max?
I think those are the facts.
All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. He is a clinical associate professor at the University of Maryland and founder of MuslimAmerican.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Fahim, if I go to you first, why is Boston called terrorism, but Aurora, Sandy Hook, Tucson, and Columbine not?
That's a great question, Peter, and let me start by saying that as a member of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Muslims who believe in the Messiah, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Qadiani, we were the first Muslim American organization to make it very clear that there is no concept of holy war in Islam, that there is no such thing as jihad against the infidel where you take a sword and try to convert the world. Now, why is that important? Because the word Islamic terrorism to me is an oxymoron. I'm coming to exactly what you're asking me. But the point is, these differences will already exist. They always will exist. And the Muslim community in America today, in fact, is asking that same very question, that why are some things labeled terrorism versus another, which is not. But more importantly, the discussion that is going on in the dinner tables, on the dinner tables these days among Muslim families is that why is it that always a non-Muslim when somebody goes to Aurora or Sandy Hook, that they're always insane, but when a Muslim commits an act of terrorism, that they're always perfectly fine psychologically.
Max, what do you think about the label terrorism? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Can I hop in?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I completely disagree. The definition of terrorism that we adhere to, certainly in North America, is threefold. First, it should involve a non-state actor, that is, an individual or a group. Secondly, the targeting, the violence, should be directed against civilians, some kind of a civilian target. And third, there should be some kind of a political aim. And it's that last point, that last part of the definition, which separates the Boston attack from the other ones which you just mentioned. The other ones which you mentioned didn't have any kind of a political motive. And so by definition, we do not regard them as terrorism, whereas in the Boston case, the sole brother who lived says that the motive was indeed political. It was religious. It was Islam. Now, I'm not saying he's in any way representative
do we really know that?
faith.
Do we really? Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Terrorism, a word we hear all of the time, but what do we mean when we use it? Is terrorism a specific form of criminality practiced under certain circumstances focused on a specific group of people? When we consider weapons, is there much that separates handmade bombs and high-tech drones? Ultimately, it would appear the only difference between justice and terrorism is whose side you are on. To Crosstalk Terrorism, I'm joined by my guest in Washington, William Bloom. He is an author of books on U.S. foreign policy and an internet newsletter called Anti-Empire Report. We also have Max Abrams. He is a terrorist expert and a fellow at Johns Hopkins University. And finally, we cross the Fahim. You know that.
Greatly distorts
Do we
it.
really know that? That it was political? Do we really know that?
Do we trust? That's what the perpetrators themselves say.
Okay, one is dead and one can't talk. William, jump in.
Yes, I would assume it was political. The older brother who's dead, he's made statements making it very clear that he has a great beef with American foreign policy, as one example. So I knew right away it was political, and that's what it is.
Fahim, go ahead.
So it can be called terrorism.
Fahim, go ahead.
Once again, and that is why, Peter, I keep repeating this. It's very important that we don't look at millions of Americans